I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Karen Burns, who is an awesome pediatric oncologist at Cincinnati Children's. She is the co-director of the Comprehensive Fertility Care and Preservation Program there and co-clinical director for the Cancer Survivorship Center. She is extremely well regarded and well published in the fields of survivorship and fertility preservation. And on a personal note, I had the chance to work with her during fellowship and just learned so much from her. So I'm really excited for all of us to learn from her today with her talk on pediatric and AYA oncofertility.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to see you again. It's great to be here. Thank you to Dr. Mian and the organizing committee and for everyone for sticking around on what I would consider a beautiful and warm Saturday afternoon out there. Certainly, compared to Ohio, we still have snow on the ground, so this is wonderful. I'm going to talk to you today about my passion, which is oncofertility, and really how this field has evolved over the last decade or two, and the importance and the impact that a fertility team can play in our world of pediatric and AYA oncology. So I have no disclosures. This is the objectives that we'll try to get through today, going through the different guidelines that are in place and the impact of our program, and we'll talk about some of our experiences in Cincinnati as long as we have time, and I'll try to leave some time for questions at the end. So, like I said, this is my passion. It's also very important to our survivors. When we talk to childhood cancer survivors, they really list this consistently as one of the top concerns following their therapy. They seem to place a greater value on parenthood and family ties than their peers who have not gone through the cancer experience. So the majority of our patients desire more information about fertility preservation effects, risks of therapy, and really that's whether they are at high risk or not, and whether they pursue a preservation option or not. Education is really something that seems to be key in this field. The majority of our survivors that are interviewed say that they would like children in the future, and they view themselves positively as parents. On the flip side of this, those who did not receive the education and do have gonatotoxic effects of therapy really associate this with a worse mental health and quality of life than the other cancer survivors. So discussing this risk of infertility and fertility preservation at the time of diagnosis can really take some of this distress away. Knowledge is power. Again, helping them to walk through this. And it can help people kind of look forward to the future, too. There are a lot of men who have banked sperm who have been interviewed, and they actually say that banking sperm helped them cope with their cancer. It gave them something to look forward to, and it gave them confidence that their medical team thought that they were going to get through this and were going to have that future. For several years now, we've had statements from the leading organizations in our field, both with ASCO, ASRM, and the nursing organization of AFON, that really stress the importance of talking about gonatotoxicity and fertility and impacts at the time of diagnosis, all the way through survivorship, knowing where to refer, knowing when to refer, and continuing any discussions regardless of any bias that may be present. So we're going to spend the next part of this talk talking about the gonatotoxic effects of our therapy in terms of fertility preservation and the impacts on future infertility. That's how I feel like as oncologists we can really help our patients and help them incorporate that into the decisions that they make regarding fertility preservation and whether or not it's what they want to pursue and whether or not it's right for them. But we also need to acknowledge that there are other factors that go into this decision and whether or not to pursue fertility preservation. One of them would be the medical risks of the procedure. For some patients, it's not going to be safe to undergo a surgical procedure. The time and safety to starting therapy, as we'll talk through some of the different preservation options, some of them are very quick. They can be accomplished in a day. Some of them take longer, and we may or may not have that time with our patients before they start therapy. I always say pediatric oncologists are not really known for their patience when it comes to finding somebody, diagnosing, and getting them started right away. Religious and cultural beliefs are certainly going to play a role for families in both directions, more likely and less likely to pursue fertility preservation. Certainly financial toxicity. Most states do not have mandated insurance coverage for fertility preservation procedures. The accessibility to these services, underlying genetic factors, whether that be a genetic syndrome, whether that be a genetic predisposition to cancer, or whether that be infertility that was going to be present whether or not this patient ever received gonadotoxic cancer therapy. And then, of course, we add in the toxicity of our therapies. So we talk about risk assessment, and when I talk about risk assessment, this is what it says and what it does not say. So for females, we're really talking about the risk of premature ovarian insufficiency or menopause prior to the age of 40. For men, we're talking about the risk of permanent oligospermia or azoospermia following therapy. And this is based on population statistics. So that means that everybody who's in that high-risk category, it is not a guarantee of infertility. Some patients who receive highly gonadotoxic therapy will have no problems with fertility 20, 30 years down the line. It also doesn't mean that everybody's in the low-risk category is going to have no problems with fertility. So we need to be clear with our families about what we're saying when we give them this information. It's obviously not perfect. I just alluded to that with the last statements. It's not an estimate of acute premature ovarian insufficiency in our female patients. So you'll see in the next couple of slides, most females will have a window of fertility from the completion of therapy to early menopause. So we're not talking about the acute effects, the acute ovarian insufficiency. It also doesn't assess those other factors related to fertility and infertility that are present in the general population. So the risk variables that we talk about are gender, age, and then therapy, and our therapy is cumulative and additive. So this is my oncology perspective and simplistic view of gamete production in males and females. So if there's any endocrinologists or REI in the audience, I apologize. You could check your email for a minute. We're just going to go through this really quick. Females, remember, are born with all of the follicles that you will ever have, and it slowly declines starting before birth and then picks up as you hit in your 30s. So premature ovarian insufficiency is really the age of menopause before the age of 40. The average age in the US is about 51. When we have chemotherapy play a role in this, or radiation play a role in this, it shifts that curve on the right, I'm not used to this pointer, I'm sorry, to the left. And so how much it does that is really uncertain, and we don't have a great way to predict that yet. But when we're talking about somebody being at risk of gonadotoxicity in females, it's shifting that curve to the left, so that instead of reaching menopause at an average of 50 or 51, it's going to be shorter than that. Whether or not that's going to impact their childbearing years is something we still struggle to predict, and that's where we try to help our family with this risk of gonadotoxicity. But you can also see if somebody received therapy at the age of 18, they're likely to have a window before that premature menopause becomes an impact in their life. Switching to males, if we talk about the cells present in the male testicle, there are Leydig cells and there are Sertoli cells. Our Leydig cells are the testosterone-producing cells. They're relatively resistant to the effects of chemotherapy and radiation therapy. The Sertoli cells, on the other hand, are the sperm-producing cells. Think of these in two layers. You have an A layer, which is your base layer, that populates the B layer. When we give chemotherapy, we quickly wipe out the B layer, and that's really common with any cytotoxic chemotherapy that we give. As long as there are enough cells in the A layer, they can repopulate the B layer. So you finish chemotherapy, you're likely to be azoospermic, but over time, you can regain your sperm count. It may go back to normal, it may stay below normal, but those cells will repopulate and you will regain a sperm count. It may take months, it may take years. There's reports of this happening more than 5 years out. The therapy is additive, so the more chemotherapy you give, the more likely you are to start to wipe out that A layer of cells, and that's when you result in permanent azoospermia. I'd also like to point out that because of the difference between Leydig cells and Sertoli cells with their susceptibility to chemotherapy, it's possible and actually common to have infertility without having a testosterone deficiency. So measuring a testosterone level is not going to help you predict whether or not somebody actually has sperm. Now to the third category, our treatments are often multimodal, which we know, so combinations of chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation, and our newer immunotherapy biologic targeted agents to achieve our cures in pediatric and AYA oncology. So for those of you in the room who are not oncologists, we'll just quickly review radiation therapy and alkylating agents. So radiation therapy works by inducing double-stranded DNA breaks in our cells. So they could be cells that are actively dividing or cells that are not dividing but still affected by the radiation. Then when they go on to try and divide, they are not able to. When we think about how this can affect gonadotoxicity and future fertility, we think about cranial and craniospinal radiation. It can impair the hypothalamic pituitary function. You can also get scatter radiation to the ovaries if you've got spinal radiation, particularly if it's photon radiation and not proton radiation. Proton has a much narrower window of scatter radiation, and we don't usually see it affect the ovaries. We talk about pelvic irradiation. It only takes very small doses of radiation directly to the testes or the ovaries to cause permanent infertility. Fibrosis of the uterus will affect the option of pregnancy later on. And then total body radiation, we add in the effects that we talked about with pelvic irradiation, but also add in the other effects of restricted uterine blood flow and restrictions on growth and future pregnancy complications from radiation targeting your other organs. There are lots of different kinds of chemotherapy, uncytotoxic chemotherapy. The one we talk about, the classification most common in gonadotoxicity, is alkylating agents. So these are resting cell cycle specific, which means that it can cause problems and it will harm cells both in dividing phases as well as quiescent phases. And so it works, again, in an additive way. The higher the doses, the more likely it's to get some of those other quiescent cells. It can cause cortical fibrosis and blood vessel damage in ovarian tissue as well, further impairing our ability to preserve fertility. So there are many alkylating agents out there. The list is long. They're not all the same. We talked about morphine equivalent dosing earlier this afternoon. In terms of gonadotoxicity, we use cyclophosphamide equivalent dosing. So dosing for gonadotoxicity with cyclophosphamide as a single agent is the most well-established dosing that we have. And in this world of multimodal therapy, it is probably the best we are going to have. So Dan Green from St. Jude used the childhood cancer survivor study as a way to generate a model that would allow us to kind of convert all of the other alkylating agents to cyclophosphamide equivalent dosing. And then that way we can use that number to risk stratify and try to help our patients with different risks of therapy. Targeted chemotherapy is a great question in the world of survivorship right now. I think as an oncologist, we're all very excited about this new era that we're in with our targeted agents, our biologic agents, immunotherapy. It's super exciting. They're usually very well tolerated by our patients with fewer acute side effects, and the hope is that they will have fewer long-term side effects as well. I think that jury is still out. We're gonna need more years of experiments, more years of research to really determine what those long-term side effects are, especially as these drugs become more widely used in our upfront therapy and our numbers are higher. There was a great publication in August of last year that looked at how these different drugs and classifications of drugs could potentially impact gonadotoxicity. And I'll spare you the very long table that's in there with all the molecular targets that could be impacted. But it is possible that these medications and these drug classes are going to have more late effects than we anticipate at this point. And so we just need to be ready for that as time goes on and as we're counseling our patients that we think that this is going to be non-toxic, but we're not sure. There are several guidelines out there available to risk stratify in terms of gonadotoxicity. The COG guidelines are available online if you haven't ever had a chance to look at them. The survivorshipguidelines.org is the website. It's free. It's open to the public. It is a very large document. It's over 300 pages long, but fortunately it's organized by drug class and radiation site, and you can also search it by body system. What it does is give you the list of, in this case, alkylating agents for males that can be impacted from a gonadotoxic standpoint. It'll tell you what those potential implications are. It gives some dosing guidelines, but very broad guidelines, which COG has done on purpose in this most recent version of the late effects guidelines. This is from October of 2023. They get updated every 5 years. You can also see the same categories for radiation therapy if you look up radiation to the testes or total body radiation. And then they did include sections for other therapeutic modalities, so that newer therapy, but as you can see, really insufficient evidence at this time, but acknowledging that this is a growing category that is more and more common with our upfront therapies, and we need to be thinking about how this is going to play a role in our survivorship world. Another group that has put out guidelines for gonadottoxicity and for cancer survivorship in general is the International Guideline Harmonization Group. And their goal is really, it's an international organization that really tries to achieve harmony amongst different countries in terms of the education and the surveillance that's provided to childhood cancer survivors. So they also published in 2016 and 2017 guidelines for gonadotoxic surveillance in our survivors. And this is the take-home points from their guidelines, really the same thing as what we see with the Children's Oncology Group. It's always nice when the guidelines go together and mirror each other, but really not specific. So not a lot of dosing recommendations in there. So this led to the development of the PIN gonadotoxic risk stratification system. So the PIN is the Pediatric Initiative Network. This is part of the Oncofertility Consortium, which is our big group in the US that works on gonadotoxicity and guideline support. So this was able to put together some tables for both males and females, divides between prepubertal and pubertal status for our females, talks about stem cell transplants, heavy metals, alkylating agent, and divides categories into minimally increased risk, which is really your low risk, your intermediate risk, and then your high risk. So this is meant to be a living document. It was first published at the end of 2020. So the second version of this is in process now. We are just working on the data pull for that, and we'll hopefully have an updated version by the end of this year or early next year, and hoping to incorporate a lot of those other agents and a lot of those other newer information. So much has changed. It's amazing when you go back and look at just the past 5 years, how many questions we have about gonadotoxic therapy, how much therapy has changed. I know I get a lot of questions about conditioning regimens used for gene transfer therapy, and that wasn't even on our radar when we first made this risk stratification system. So lots of questions for the new version. Hopefully we're able to come up with lots of answers for everyone. As fertility teams evolve and expand and as this field grows, we have more and more subspecialists outside of the world of pediatric oncology involved in these consults and involved in providing education to families. Not everyone has access to the Children's Oncology Group protocols and has the ability to go through and calculate that CED for any particular patient to use in the tables. So we thought it would be a fun task to go through all of the phase 3 COG protocols from 2000 up until current, which at the time was 2021, I believe. I think we have some from 2022, and develop risk stratification tables. So you can see there was one for solid tumors, there is one for CNS tumors, and then one for the leukemia and lymphoma tumors. And what it looks like is lots of tables for all the different protocols organized by disease. And then each table has the categories for cumulative alkylating agent dose, platinums, radiation, yes or no, and then it will give you the risk category. This is one for neuroblastoma. It just happens to be one that I pulled that has some treatment programs where the total number of cycles is dependent on response. So that's why you see a range there. So hopefully that will help to standardize our recommendations and allow people who don't have access to the protocols to still be able to find this information. So once we have our fertility risk assessment and we're talking to the family, we also need to know what our preservation options are. And really, when we talk about fertility preservation for these patients, we're talking about ways to protect the gametes. So that is either to remove the mature gametes before they're exposed to chemotherapy, or preserve the tissue, ideally before it's exposed to chemotherapy, but certainly before it's exposed to high-risk levels of our offending agents. So starting with the females, the standard of care would be oocyte and embryo cryopreservation. So basically you could see the graphic on the right where we're talking about removing mature oocytes, either combining with sperm to form embryos and then freezing the embryos, or cryopreserving the oocytes themselves and then thawing and combining with sperm at a later date when they're ready for pregnancy. You then use IVF to achieve pregnancy. So it has well-established success rates, limited adolescent and oncology-specific data, but really gaining in this area and really seems to be mirroring the adult population. There are some barriers, not the least of which in the pediatric world is that you have to have gone through puberty in order to be able to do this. So all of our younger patients do not have this option prior to therapy. It does remain an option after therapy in that survivorship window prior to menopause. There is a time delay in treatment. It takes 10 to 14 days in order to do this. So for our patients who don't have that luxury to wait, we're not able to offer this. There are some problems and concerns culturally and age-specific for the transvaginal monitoring and retrieval that has to go with this. It's possible to do it transabdominally. There's not very many REIs in the US who like to use that approach. Cost and insurance coverage is going to be a recurring theme with this, oftentimes not covered. The other option that we have for our families is ovarian tissue cryopreservation. So again, looking at the schematic on the right-hand side, this is accomplished by an OR procedure where either the whole ovary or part of the ovary is removed. The cortex is then cut into strips, which are frozen and cryopreserved for later use. So following the branch on the right, most commonly, this is then placed back into the body through an ovarian tissue transplantation procedure where some of those strips are sewn onto the remaining ovary. Then they can go on to conceive naturally or IVF with embryo transfer. The branch on the left is labeled future technology. We're starting to see some of this come into play. So many institutions will now remove any primordial follicles that are farther along in the maturation process prior to freezing and freeze them as oocytes for cryopreservation to be used in the same way as our prior algorithm. It can also be potentially matured in vitro to then go straight to IVF. Or there are laboratories, especially at Northwestern, Monica LaRonda has been working on an artificial ovary for several years now so that the native tissue itself does not need to be replaced, and those follicles themselves are what's replaced. This has had a good amount of success. So the OTC procedure itself is no longer considered experimental. That came off experimental status in 2020. So for several years now, it has been considered standard of care. There's good success rates. The last published meta-analysis was in 2018, I believe, with over 200 births. So it's getting common enough that people have stopped publish a lot of their successes with this. The average graft lifespan looks good at 4 to 5 years. There's a lot of variability in that. For some, it's as short as just maybe 6 to 9 months. For others, it's lasted over 9 years in multiple pregnancies and multiple births. Great restoration of endocrine function. I will say the big caveat to this is that this is data from patients who had ovarian tissue cryopreservation done after puberty. So we really do not have data yet on that prepubertal population. So we're unable to say if the success rates are going to be just as high. Your ovary goes through lots of changes with puberty, right? It's not very active in the prepubertal state. So we have preclinical data suggesting that it could work, but it's really going to need to play out in the real world over the next 1 to 2 decades as these patients age and as they start to come back and want to use their tissue. Again, some of the barriers, cost and insurance coverage, the need for an additional surgical procedure to replace the tissue, and then the potential need for assisted reproductive technology with IVF down the line. Some of the controversies that go with ovarian tissue cryopreservation, so there's a theoretical risk of malignant contamination of the tissue that you put back into the patient, and that is one of the main reasons the other side of that algorithm is being developed so that the native tissue does not have to be replaced. Dror Mir in Israel has been at the forefront of this technology for several years now. They have developed a pretty extensive protocol that involves MRD testing both at the time of the ovarian tissue harvest. So patients with leukemia are MRD negative before they have their OTC procedure. There's extensive testing on the tissue prior to reimplantation, including going to the step of xenographing in mice to make sure that there is no transfer of malignant cells. There's MRD testing on the tissue before they replace it. And they have been able to do it successfully without any recurrence of the disease to this point. But they've also found that many patients whose tissue is morphologically negative, either at the time of freezing or at the time of thaw, do have MRD positivity in their tissue samples, and they have been denied having their tissue replaced. So we tell a lot of our patients who have leukemia that really, if they're going to pursue OTC, they are banking on these other technologies, the in vitro maturation, the removal of mature oocytes before freezing, to really develop in order for this to be successful for them. The other controversy that has come up in recent years is what happens with the single ovary. Well, we're taking an ovary out. Are we actually reducing their number of years of fertility compared to if we had left it in? Even though their risk is high for premature ovarian insufficiency, are we making it worse? Looking at the general population, you can see that the average age of menopause with one ovary compared to two is 1 to 2 years earlier than it would have been otherwise. But we really just don't have the data to know if that translates to our population, both the oncology population and the pediatric oncology population as we do these procedures. There was a study published about 1.5 years ago out of France. They looked at their transplant population and had small numbers of patients who had ovarian tissue cryopreservation. They had about 125 patients in the whole cohort. 9 of them had had OTC prior to their transplant, but they all were in POI when they looked at their numbers. There are some caveats to that. They also found that age was a risk for developing POI, and all the patients with OTC were also older. So some things to definitely work out, but it has really increased heightened awareness around this issue. It's currently being investigated in a lab model at the NIH. Veronica Gomez-Lobo is currently working on that, and I know other institutions are looking at their data to try to help tease out this as fast as we can for our transplant patients. And some other strategies for our females who are going through therapy. There is a COG study. Jen Levine is one of the PIs that just opened this past month looking at GnRH analog therapy to try to help answer the question once and for all. I don't know if it's going to do that, but we're going to try, about whether or not there's any advantage to using this in terms of fertility preservation. So switching over to our males, sperm cryopreservation is the standard of care. It's the most established option for fertility preservation for men. We try to offer it to all of our males who are able to bank a specimen. So remember, the risk for our males, most become azoospermic very quickly after starting therapy. The risk is that they're not going to recover. So if they're not able to bank prior to starting therapy, they may have lost that opportunity permanently. So they may be low risk to start out. The perfect example is our patient with ALL, with leukemia. Their risk of gonatotoxicity is low with upfront protocols, but if they don't respond to therapy and end up going to transplant or relapse and go to transplant before they've recovered their sperm count, they're not going to have a chance to sperm bank at that point, and their window is probably going to close as transplant is highly gonadotoxic. So we try to offer to everyone, and certainly our non-malignant transplant patients, we offer to them before they go to transplant. For patients who are prepubertal or who are not able to give a specimen, we have the option of testicular tissue cryopreservation. So this is an experimental procedure only. It has not actually been proven to work in humans. You'll see the success that they've had so far in just a minute. But basically, the tissue is obtained through a biopsy. It's cryopreserved either in cell suspension or testicular tissue blocks and strips, and then is replaced at a later time at this point, when the patient is ready to start thinking about families, producing a family. We try to coordinate it with other surgical procedures to minimize the anesthesia risk and expedite whenever possible. These are your options, or what is predicted to be your options for replacing the tissue and achieving pregnancy in biological children. So it has been proven to work in mammals. So this is Grady. He was the first monkey born using this procedure. And the University of Pittsburgh is the center of this trial in the United States. They have opened their human trial. They did their first patient a little over a year ago, so still waiting on results for that. Other options for our males, Tessie, where you can use a needle to aspirate mature sperm. If there are portions of the testicle that are able to produce, like if you have pockets of those A cells that have repopulated those B cells, you can go in pre-chemotherapy, post-chemotherapy, and try to aspirate and go directly to ICSI. And also you can use testicular shielding if you're going to do radiation therapy. There are some guidelines that try to speak to what procedures can be offered depending on your risk of gonatotoxic therapy. This is the IGHG group again. It's a really busy slide. Please don't read it. Basically, your options for fertility preservation are on the left. The risk of therapy is on the right, with high risk being all the way over on your left and not at risk being all the way on the right. Same thing for females. I advanced too fast. I apologize. The green blocks are strong recommendations based on the literature. The yellow are moderate, and the red is not recommended. The white blocks are insufficient evidence. So just to try to help guide as we move forward with this. This is also under review. It was published in 2021, so the plan is every 5 years to update this as well. So as this gets more complicated, as time is of the essence, as we get more and more specialists involved in this, it becomes easier to have a specialty team in some cases do these consults. So many institutions have moved forward with the idea of a fertility consult team to take the onus off of the oncology team to remember all of this information, have all those connections, and provide that so they can focus on the treatments for the cancer. So as this is becoming more popular, we're getting more and more literature out there discussing the positive benefits of the fertility team and increasing access, increasing education, and improving quality of life through that education piece. This is an article that talks about, it's a roadmap to building a fertility team. It's what I wish I had when we first started doing this, because it will spell out the first steps that you need to think about when developing your team, assembling the team, who's essential, who's not essential, who's nice to have if you have the luxury of that resource. Trying to find your people who are passionate about it to really lead the charge. How to identify your patients, different techniques that different institutions have used to identify patients in a timely fashion to get them their consult, common barriers, and even some ethical considerations. So it's a great article. I highly recommend it if you are considering developing a team. Speaking of the team, this is what we went through to develop our team in Cincinnati. So this slide, I called it the early days, but it's really the roadmap of what not to do when developing your team, because we did not know what we were doing, and we apparently need to learn our lessons the hard way. So we started this in 2009. We started with 2 physicians. It was me and one of our adolescent gynecology physicians. We didn't have enough manpower, so we recruited anybody else who would be on our team, which really meant that we had people cross-covering all the time, right? I could talk about the oncology impact and the treatment impact, but I would get patients asking me about, well, what happens in the OR? And those are very hard questions to answer. And that was happening to all of us. We did not have great relationships with REI. We did not have those great relationships in place with our surgery teams. And so even when we got to see the consults, we really had a hard time delivering on what we were trying to offer. And so it led to a lot of confusion about who should refer, what we were going to do if they referred, and had missed opportunities and inequality. So we regrouped in 2013, and the Comprehensive Fertility Care and Preservation Program was born. I also highly recommend a shorter name if you're going to name your team, because that's a mouthful. We sat down and got all of our stakeholders at the same table, and you can see the different groups that are involved in our team here. We have a leadership team that consists of oncology, PAG, urology, and our nursing head, which is our first navigator. We use social work and psychology from our oncology teams to help us. And we really took the approach that we could do it. We could do anything, but no one person was going to do everything. So we are not all involved in every consult, but many of us are involved in every consult, just kind of putting in what we do best and coming together for the patient. We also worked to expand our fertility preservation options, formalized our relationship with our UC REI colleagues. We streamlined our process. We worked long and hard with the OR and with our surgeons, because we often do line placement at the same time, to get those OR slots, know that we were going to need them fast, and make the process as seamless as we could. And we created an operational definition so we could be clear and transparent about what we wanted to do. So this is our goal. We wanted to do greater than 90% regardless of risk. So we wanted to see that low risk patient, we wanted to see that high risk patient, so we could tell everybody what that education was surrounding gonadotoxicity. We want to be inclusive. We also want to be appropriate. So we have accepted exclusions from our consults that you could see listed here. We will still consult if somebody only had surgery and they have questions. We are still happy to see them. We just don't automatically trigger that consult. We looked around at our other resources too and what we had available to us. So we worked with the University of Cincinnati, who has a great design program, to come up with these handouts that we can give families. So everybody gets a folder and they get the handout that applies to them. So if they have the option of ovary freezing, OTC, that handout will be in their folder when we go talk to them. So it gives them something to write on, it gives them something to look at, and gives them something to prove that we were there, basically. Those first few days are crazy with a new diagnosis, and it's so easy to forget. We also worked with our Live Well Collaborative, which is our co-op program for our design school at Cincinnati, to develop these videos. So they can see the video before we even go in the room, have a basic understanding, or at least have heard what it is we're going to be talking about, and they can watch them over and over and over again. They're available on YouTube. They're on our website for our fertility preservation program. So we thought we had it all figured out. It turns out we did not. Getting a fertility consult was still a problem, and it was hard to gain the trust of the oncology team. People weren't quite sure what we wanted to do or why, and they weren't sure how to remember it. So we went back and addressed all of that. So the oncologist on the team is usually me. We stress communication before the patient. So before my team would ever go in the room, I would have a conversation with that primary treating team to talk about what the therapy was going to be, what the timeline was going to be before they started, and then I would tell them what we were going to talk to the patient about. So we could really represent the whole team when we went in there and all be on the same page. We did education session after education session with our staff at all levels to talk about what we could do, how we were going to do it, what our operational definition was, and then we showed up everywhere. It's hard to forget about somebody if they're always right in front of you, so we went to every meeting we could think of, every tumor board, every patient care meeting. We got our care managers involved and came up with multiple ways to contact us. So if somebody said, gosh, I'd remember to do this if I could email you, fine, done. fertilityconsult@cchmc.org, it's there. Personal communication, we have our own phone number, our website, everything. So they had no excuse to not call us. We got our care managers involved. They put the orders in. We have something called a new patient order set. We became part of that order set. The care managers are in charge of making sure it gets put in. It defaults to yes. So if you do not want a fertility consult, you have to manually go in, check no, and then you get a pop-up that shows our exclusions that I listed on an earlier slide, and you have to pick one of those. So if your reason for not wanting one is not one of those, you have to call us and we have to talk about it. So that we got in with most of our patients. So, and we started small, aimed high. I know we've talked about this a little bit. We started with our leukemia team, got things going there, moved it on to our solid tumor team, did some tweaks for that, neuro-onc, and then bone marrow transplant. And our navigator is probably what made this work. I cannot stress enough the importance of like a navigator, having that champion. Olivia Frias is our navigator. She was, I think, the second one in the country. We modeled her role after Kristen Smith, who's at the university, who's at Northwestern, and originated the role. She is our biggest champion. She is the face of our program. You'll see our data in a second about how this improved our program. It's also been published by other institutions now, how much having that navigator can increase your rate of referral and can increase your patients who are interested in fertility preservation and capturing. They have formed their own group within the Oncofertility Consortium. They're the navigator committee. It started with about 5 to 10 patients. Last meeting in November, they had well over 100. They meet every month. They're incredibly inclusive, so if anybody is interested, please, I have Olivia's contact information at the end of this. Like, she would love to hear from you, and I'm happy to connect you if I can. This is their group at the last meeting. And this is our process. So it says BMT substitute oncology. It works for both teams. Consult comes in, it goes to the navigator. She gives it to me or whoever's covering for me. I go to the team. It goes back to the navigator. She takes it to gynecology or to urology. and then it goes back to her again to follow up. So at all stages, it's going through our navigator, and she really keeps everything together. And this is our P chart that we used in the beginning. It's an old slide. It obviously doesn't go to present when it stops at 2017, but you can see over on the left where we started with our fertility consults not being able to really get that 90%, and you can see the yellow boxes where our fertility navigator got involved, and we were really very quickly able to move things up. You can see the 4 missed patients. That's when she went on maternity leave. So in addition to telling her she couldn't do that again, we cross-trained a little bit, and the curve got rather boring after a while. But as a survivorship doc, before I move on to the business side, I have to talk about the importance of survivorship too, because it's super important to keep talking about fertility in that realm. So for patients who are or are not at risk, it's really important to talk about contraception, because it only takes 1 egg, it only takes 1 sperm. It could still happen even if they were told they were at high risk. It's an opportunity to monitor for GVHD, to evaluate males' semen analysis, referral to urology if they'd like to pursue TESE. It's an opportunity for females to make sure, to assess for ovarian insufficiency, to look for follicles, to follow serial AMH, to talk about other pregnancy risk factors. And it's also an opportunity for anybody who did preservation to review where that tissue is, what the cost is, and make sure they're all aware of how to access that tissue. In the last couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about the business side of this, because we are not able to do this without forming a plan and sustaining it. So fertility programs are usually driven by purpose over profit, right? So one of the things that is key is knowing your audience and knowing their motivation. In Cincinnati, our leadership really believes strongly in doing what's right for the patient. So finding those patient stories from our early days really served as proofs of concept and went a long way with our leadership. They're also, they really like to be innovative and ahead of the curve. And so they were willing to use those patient stories and our vision to give us a little bit of free rein to build this up. Not all the value is monetary either. There is the academic side of fertility preservation and oncofertility is still pretty wide open. So there's the option to build that up as well. But really a lot of the financial value is indirect, and I'll show you how we used our data to help show that to our leadership to get funding. So why you should track improved patient care, we've learned more from our misses than we learned from any of our successes. We've literally gone back to all of them to see what went wrong and why we didn't know about the patient. They'll support your research endeavors to help grow that academic side. We use it to celebrate our team and say thank you when we hit milestones like 100 and 200 ovarian tissue procedures. And it'll help you show how you can make that downstream revenue. So our team over the last 10 years, you can see our consults went up. That initial jump was Olivia and our fertility navigator. Our consult successes also were increased as we developed the program. And importantly, our surgical volumes went up too. So that drove a lot of our downstream revenue with those lines and all of the lab work and everything that goes with that. And so brought in money to the institution, even if it wasn't directly to the fertility team. As we were able to show that growth, we were able to grow our program, and at each step show how that addition was able to continue growing and continue the mission and the vision. And that helped with our funding. We were initially supported by divisional funds and just a whole lot of passion. Through self-promotion, we started to get institute recognition. We actually got an institutional grant that would support our growth and our research growth, and then continued from there to get more institutional funding, donor funding, which we used to offset the cost of our fertility procedures, and moving forward. And we're now institutionally funded. We're able to show why, how we're impacting our families too. So this is our patients in our database that had a fertility option for them. So you can see 38% across the board. But if we look at that high-risk population, the ones that we really worry about, almost half of them were able to take advantage of a fertility preservation option. And our goal is not to increase our fertility preservation procedures. It's to provide that education. But this can help us show that our education is hopefully making a difference. Our increase in outpatient visits, mostly inpatient consults, but these patients also come back for POI screening and other things. And our outside referral growth, this is our surgery growth as well. So that has driven a lot of our downstream revenue, and showing things like this to our leadership has helped keep them invested in the program. We're not a division, right? We're made up of multiple different divisions. So this is how we can come together and show that we're doing something for our families. So This is my conclusion slide. The subject is important for our families. Estimating the risk is a moving target. It's going to continue to change over the years. It's one of the exciting areas of medicine, I think, as it's evolving. A fertility team can really help move this along, can really help keep things going in the right direction, and then focusing on incremental growth, building those relationships, and looking for funding in unusual places. One of our donors is our gift shop. It's a non-for-profit gift shop. They donate their profits every year. You can pitch your goal, and they choose the one they want. And so that's how we have offset a lot of our costs. And so I just want to say thank you. This is my team. So Krista Childress is our PAG lead. Andrew Strine is our urology lead. Olivia Frias is our navigator extraordinaire. And you can see everyone else there. Thank our patient and families too. These are just some additional resources. There's a lot of information on those websites. Olivia's email is there. My email is also there. I unfortunately have to run shortly after this to catch my flight, but I'm more than happy to talk about this anytime. So please feel free to send an email and some funding resources on the right, because there's never enough funding for this and never enough insurance coverage. So thank you. Any questions? Do you have time for questions?
Thank you so much for such a fantastic talk on something critically important. Are there any questions? Yes. Sorry. Good thing I have long legs.
So in the age of gene therapy,
Yeah.
how is this being incorporated into the non-malignant diagnoses that are potentially going to gene therapy, but also being exposed to busulfan, since most of the protocols include busulfan?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't have the perfect answer. So right now, we do all of our risk assessments based off the therapy and not necessarily the indication for the therapy, right? So busulfan in conditioning regimens is considered high risk. I don't know if that's the right answer or not. I'm hoping to be able to find that answer as we do this next set of the guidelines, but I am not feeling very optimistic about it because I just don't think that that data is there yet. I also don't know that it's necessarily completely wrong to say that they're high risk without evidence to show otherwise, right? Because you're saying they're at risk, they're at high risk for gonatotoxicity. You're not promising them it will happen, but they also need to know that, like, this is a concern and this is a worry and this is where we are right now. So these consults are very dynamic. It's shared decision making at its best for the families, right? So
I have to make it easy there. Yeah, what a good talk. Thank you. Can you compare and contrast electroejaculation with the direct, aspiration of a testicle for gathering sperm for preservation, cryopreservation without for whatever reason the male can't ejaculate or whatever?
yeah, I can to a degree. So I think if you're talking about Tessie or something like that, you're really getting individual sperm, hopefully multiples, but certainly not what you would get with a semen sample, achieved another way. So you're looking at doing like ICSI or something like that.
When do you do that? When do you aspirate the testicle for semen? I mean,
So we send them to urology. So we have a urologist who's interested in reproductive medicine. And so he does his evaluation to try to see if there's any viable pockets of sperm. Because it is possible to have viable pockets, but still have a zero count in your ejaculate.
so you're talking about that's after the fact. That's
So
not
you could do it,
before.
you technically could do it before.
Okay.
There's certainly documented, especially like in Hodgkin's, right? Like you can have azoospermia related to the disease process itself.
Right.
So it could be helpful in that. I have never sent somebody pre. We have sent some males post therapy who had a zero sperm count when we did their semen analysis to see if there was anything there that they were able to do. It is very expensive at this point. So it's thousands of dollars to do that in addition to your ICSI then and all your monitoring.
Gotcha. I should know this, but I don't, and I bet you do. So this is legal. So the male or the female, if they pass away, who owns, controls, who has control of that?
So our
Those gametes, right?
Yep, all of our tissue, it's not stored on site. So we use Reprotec, which is one of the most common storage facilities in the US. They're the ones who handle that, but it's part of the consenting process that's done on their end before they accept the tissue, that it's laid out beforehand in the event that you do not survive your cancer, what should happen to your tissue. In pediatrics, they can choose a little bit in that they can choose it's donated to research or it's destroyed. For people who are older, usually I'm so used to the pediatric realm, right? Where like they're doing it and they don't have a partner. I don't know the details on the adult side of it. If there was a couple who were very clear about one having the other. But I know in pediatrics, it's done right up front. It's part of the initial consent process before the tissue is transferred. And it's donate to research or destroyed. We have a big international population that comes from like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and it is very important to them sometimes to have the whole body go back. And so we've actually gotten tissue back from Reprotec in the past to send back with the family if they were going back to their home country for burial.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.